Most people walk into a room and ask, without realizing it, what do I need to be right now so that they like me? And there is a minority who walk into the same room and simply exist. The difference between these two groups is not charisma, it is not luck, it is not genetic magnetism. Carl Jung, decades before the word aura became a cliché of shelf-bought spirituality, had already described the phenomenon with surgical precision. There are people whose presence is so coherent, so aligned between what they think, feel, and do, that this coherence becomes visible before a single word is even spoken. And the most disturbing thing is not that these people attract admiration, it is that they provoke, in almost identical proportions, fascination and repulsion. If you have ever felt that your mere presence bothers people who don't even really know you, this video will not console you. It will explain the mechanism. And the mechanism, like every Jungian truth, is colder than any self-help theory has ever had the courage to admit. Let's start by destroying an illusion. You grew up hearing that aura is a kind of mystical energy, something you buy in crystal shops, something you charge with incense and full moons. Jung had no patience for this kind of decorative mysticism. For him, what people call an aura is, in reality, the observable result of a very specific psychic process, integration. An integrated person is one in whom the persona, the social mask we all wear to negotiate with the world, and the shadow, everything we repress in order to be accepted, are no longer in open warfare. When these two internal territories stop sabotaging each other, something happens in the body, the voice, the gaze, the way of occupying space. It is not supernatural energy. It is the absence of internal fracture. And the human being, through millions of years of evolution in social groups, has developed an almost animal capacity to detect fracture or the absence of fracture in others, long before any words are exchanged. This is what you feel when you enter a room and someone changes the environment without doing absolutely anything. This person is not trying to impress anyone. And it is precisely that absence of trying that others' nervous systems pick up as something rare, almost threatening, in an entire society trained to perform. Think of it this way. Most human interactions are a theater with an invisible script. Everyone has tacitly agreed to pretend a little, soften a little, hide a little. This creates a kind of shared social frequency, predictable, safe. When someone appears without following this script, without needing to lie to be tolerated, without needing to diminish their truth to fit into the room, that person breaks the frequency. And a broken frequency in the human nervous system is not processed as neutral. It is processed as a signal that demands immediate interpretation. Is this danger or is this attraction? When in doubt, many people's brains choose discomfort because discomfort is safer than vulnerability. That is why a genuinely authentic presence never goes unnoticed. It is always noted. The only variable is whether that notation will turn into admiration or rejection. And this variable, as you will understand throughout this script, does not depend on you. It depends entirely on the relationship that each person around you has with their own mask. Here is the first antithesis you need to engrave. Your presence does not bother others because you did something wrong. It bothers them because you stopped doing something they still do compulsively, which is explaining yourself, justifying yourself, shrinking yourself. It is not about what you are. It is about what your existence reveals about those who are not yet. When a person develops this internal coherence, this aura in the Jungian sense of the term, they begin to function, without choosing to, as a walking psychological mirror. And a mirror, by definition, does not create anything. It only reflects. The problem is that most people have never learned how to look at a psychological mirror without confusing the reflection with a personal attack. Imagine someone who has spent their entire life compressing their own ambition so as not to seem too arrogant to their family. This person encounters someone who simply exercises ambition without apologizing, without diminishing themselves, without negotiating their will against the discomfort of others. What happens internally is not pure admiration. It is admiration mixed with an almost imperceptible sting of irritation. Why? Because that presence exposes, unintentionally, the extent of the self-censorship that this person practices every day. No one likes to be confronted with their own prison, especially when that prison was built with their own hands, decades ago, to emotionally survive within a family or a social group. This explains a phenomenon that most people have never managed to name: why good people, people who did nothing wrong, are still treated with coldness, distance, or even veiled hostility by those close to them. The answer is unsettling because it is simple. Proximity to authenticity acts as a silent invitation for everyone around to confront their own lack of it, and unsolicited confrontation, even when silent, triggers a defense reaction. Jung described this through the mechanism of projection. Each person, when observing you, is not seeing you clearly. They are seeing a blank canvas where they project their own unresolved conflicts. If someone has repressed envy, they will see you as arrogant. If someone has a repressed fear of being abandoned, they will see you as distant. If someone has never had the courage to say no, they will see you as selfish just because you set boundaries. None of this is about you. It is about the psychological material that each person carries and that your presence inadvertently illuminates. And here lies one of the most uncomfortable truths that Jung ever formulated. You are never seen exactly as you are. You are seen through the filter of what each observer has yet to resolve within themselves. That is why two people can observe the exact same behavior of yours and have completely opposite reactions. One will call you inspiring, another will call you too intense, too much, or difficult to deal with. The difference has never been in your behavior. It has been in the mirror each of them carried. There is a moment, usually around one's early 30s, when most people realize they made a silent pact. They traded pieces of their own identity for acceptance. They dimmed their opinions to avoid friction. They hid their talents to avoid sparking competition. They swallowed their boundaries to avoid being called difficult. This pact works for a while as a social anesthetic, but anesthesia does not heal. It only delays the pain. And when this person encounters someone who never made this pact or who has already broken it, the anesthesia fails for a few seconds. It is in this interval, short, almost invisible, that the discomfort you have probably felt coming from others without understanding why is born. It is precisely at this point, when authentic presence begins to expose the price others pay for their own masks, that most people commit a fatal error. They interpret the discomfort of others as a sign that they need to shrink themselves again. They return to compressing their own voice. They go back to apologizing for taking up space. And it is precisely here that individuation, the Jungian process of becoming who you really are, is aborted before it even begins. That is why I prepared the Código do Despertar for you. It does not exist to teach you how to please those who are bothered by your truth. It exists to give you, in 60 days, an inner map based on the psychology of Carl Jung, with a daily lesson, a practical key, a question that cuts deep, and a declaration that reorganizes your identity from within. You read, carry out the micro-action of the day, and record what emerges in your journal. It is not abstract theory about the unconscious. It is the path, structured from restlessness to clear direction, the process of stopping the explanation of oneself and starting to become. The first step is pinned in the first comment. If you feel you have already paid too high a price to fit into the space of those who never had the courage to be authentic, comment "Now eu escolho minha verdade" and take the first step before the anesthesia starts to take effect again. If authentic presence acts as a mirror, there is an even deeper layer that Jung explored like few psychologists before or since: the shadow. And here it is essential to abandon the jargon. Shadow is not someone's bad side, as common sense has lazily simplified it. Shadow is everything you have buried within yourself to continue being loved by people who only knew how to love an edited version of you. It is your anger swallowed at family gatherings. It is your ambition, hidden so as not to seem too full of yourself. It is your boundary ignored time and time again until you learned the hard way that saying no cost too much in affection. And things that are buried, contrary to popular belief, do not die in the ground. They ferment. And what ferments eventually leaks. It leaks as resentment in passive-aggressive comments. It leaks as envy disguised as constructive criticism. It leaks as sudden hostility directed at someone who, in truth, did nothing but exist without asking for permission. A person with authentic presence activates the shadow of others simply by not operating from their own repressed shadow. And that is unbearable for those who still live behind doors locked from the inside. Think of the dynamic like this. If you have been in a locked room for 20 years in the dark and someone walks in carrying a bright light, the first impulse is not gratitude. It is physical pain in the eyes. It is the impulse to scream for the light to be turned off. Not because the light is hostile, but because prolonged darkness has rendered the eyes incapable of bearing brightness without suffering. It is exactly this reaction that many authentic people receive from people who, deep down, know they need to change, but have not yet gathered the courage to go through it. Here is another antithesis that sustains this entire chapter. The discomfort your presence provokes is not proof that you did something wrong. It is proof that you have stopped negotiating your truth in exchange for the comfort of others. It is not about whom you hurt. It is about whom you reminded unintentionally of their own silence. This does not mean that every criticism directed at you is, by definition, a projection of another's shadow. It would be naive and narcissistic to think so. But there is a pattern that is easy to identify. When criticism comes loaded with intensity disproportionate to what you actually did, when your small gestures generate huge emotional reactions in those watching, this almost always indicates that you touched, inadvertently, an exposed nerve that already existed before you appeared. And here lies a responsibility that many authentic people prefer to ignore. You do not need to feel guilty for activating another's shadow. But you also do not need to use this as an excuse to dismiss all forms of self-criticism. Discernment is the line between real integration and narcissism disguised as spirituality. Let's touch briefly on a point that many people ignore when the subject is authenticity and presence. Have you noticed how small children, before they learn to filter their reactions through social etiquette, react instinctively to certain people? To some people, they approach without hesitation. From others, even while smiling, they keep a silent distance. Animals do the same. Dogs, especially, are known for reacting with suspicion to people whom adult humans are still trying to decipher through layers of upbringing, social hierarchy, and forced courtesy. This is not a coincidence, nor magical sensitivity. It is the nervous system of these beings, not yet conditioned by the excess of adult socialization, capturing directly the energetic coherence or incoherence of the person standing before them. Jung. He maintained that the unconscious communicates far more honestly than verbal language, which is constantly edited by social consciousness. A child or an animal is not processing their speech, their clothing, their job title, or their social network. They are capturing, in a pre-verbal way, the coherence between what you project outward and what you truly are within. When these two layers are aligned, the reaction is usually one of natural, almost magnetic attraction. When there is a fracture between the mask and the internal content, even if that fracture is invisible to adults trained in courtesy, children and animals often react with hesitation, withdrawal, or silent mistrust. This should make you completely rethink what you consider social validation. Adult approval can be bought with rhetoric, status, or a well-rehearsed performance. The instinctive approach of a child or an animal cannot. There is no job title, designer clothing, or sophisticated vocabulary capable of deceiving a nervous system that has not yet learned how to lie to itself. This is why, historically, many cultures have considered the reaction of children and animals to be a reliable indicator of character. It is not superstition. It is empirical observation that internal coherence emits a signal that language alone cannot manufacture. A necessary correction is needed here. This does not mean that every person a child avoids is automatically bad or incoherent. There are multiple emotional variables at play, but the general pattern is robust enough to serve as a powerful metaphor. Beings who have not yet learned to decode social performance respond to the essence, not the packaging. And if your presence awakens an instinctive approach in these beings, it usually indicates something that no validation from adults trained in courtesy will ever be able to confirm with the same honesty. Now we arrive at the point that most people prefer to ignore when they fantasize about having a striking presence. This presence is never born from comfort. It is born from rupture. No one develops an aura of internal coherence living inside a safe, protected zone without ever having been forced to confront their own contradictions. The presence you admire in someone, that capacity to occupy space without apologizing, was almost always forged within a crisis that demanded a total reconstruction of identity. Divorces that dismantled identities built around someone else. Layoffs that forced someone to discover who they were outside of a job title. Losses that forced a direct confrontation with finitude and, consequently, with the urgency of stopping the waste of one's own life by performing someone else's roles. Jung called this process individuation, the journey of consciously integrating the shadow, recognizing the projections you cast upon others, and reclaiming, piece by piece, everything that was abandoned to fit into relationships, families, and systems that demanded your edited version. It is a painful process by definition, because it requires destroying an identity built to survive socially, even knowing that this destruction will generate temporary instability, external judgment, and often the distancing of people who only tolerated your anesthetized version. It is not about being born with charisma. It is about surviving your own collapse and choosing deliberately to rebuild your identity based on truth rather than convenience. It is not a gift. It is a scar that has been processed, not just hidden under a new layer of performance. This explains why people with authentic presence tend to carry a kind of serene, almost imperceptible melancholy behind the strength they emit. It is not weakness. It is the mark of someone who has gone through something real. Those who have never had to rebuild their own identity from scratch tend to have a lighter, more superficial presence that is easier to please, but they rarely possess the density that makes an entire room feel their arrival, even before you say anything. And here is perhaps the hardest truth to accept within this journey. You do not choose when the rupture begins. It usually chooses you through a loss, a betrayal, an illness, a professional collapse. What you do choose is what to do after the impact. Most people facing such a crisis choose to rebuild exactly the same mask as before, only with extra reinforcement, with more layers of protection, more fear of exposing any fissures again. A minority, however, uses the rupture as an opening for real integration. And it is precisely this minority that, years later, is described by those who know them as someone with a different presence, without anyone being able to explain exactly why. There is a huge difference between surviving a crisis and processing it. To survive means to keep functioning, paying bills, smiling in photos, moving forward in appearance. To process means to consciously descend to the emotional root of what broke, to name what was lost, to integrate what was previously repressed, and to rebuild identity on a more honest foundation, even if that foundation is more fragile at the beginning. It is this second path, the most difficult, the loneliest one, that produces the internal coherence capable of generating what this video calls a powerful aura. The problem is that no one goes through this process efficiently alone. The human mind is excellent at avoiding exactly what it most needs to confront, because confronting hurts and pain is something the brain is biologically programmed to avoid in the short term, even when the long-term cost is remaining trapped in a fragmented version of oneself. It was precisely with this point of rupture in mind, this exact moment where reconstruction can become conscious or can be aborted out of fear, that the Código do Despertar was structured. 60 days, one daily lesson, one key, one question that forces clarity, and one declaration that reorganizes identity, all anchored in Jungian psychology, to transform crisis into real individuation, instead of letting the crisis become just another layer of mask. Access is in the first pinned comment. If you have already gone through a rupture and feel that you still haven't processed what it really demanded of you, comment, "Estu pronto para integrar," now, before the impulse to return to the safe zone erases this decision. We have reached the point where everything connects. An authentic presence will always divide opinions, because it is never neutral to those who observe. It is either a silent invitation to growth or an unbearable mirror of everything that is still repressed. There is no comfortable middle ground when someone stops performing and begins to simply be. And here is the final antithesis you need to carry after this video. Your presence does not exist to be approved by everyone. It exists to separate, with almost cruel precision, those who are ready to evolve by your side from those who still need your absence to remain comfortable within their own illusion. This is not a reason for arrogant pride, nor a justification for despising those who haven't reached where you have reached. It is merely a cold realization of how the human psyche works. Truth always provokes a reaction, and reaction is never exempt. The closer you get to who you really are, the fewer people will be able to remain indifferent to your presence. Some will draw closer, seeking what you represent. Others will distance themselves, unable to endure the mirror that you, without any intention, carry. You can close this video now and go back to compressing your voice to fit into spaces that only tolerate edited versions of you. You can continue apologizing for taking up space, continue softening your truth so as not to bother those who decided, a long time ago, not to confront their own shadow. Or you can accept the price, which was never small, of being whole, less easy approval, but real presence. Fewer people around, but none of them requiring you to diminish yourself to stay. The Código do Despertar is pinned in the first comment, waiting for those who have already understood that there is no going back to being anesthetized. The choice, as it has always been, was never in the hands of those who are bothered by you. It has always been in yours.